What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. A while ago, I got into a discussion with Laura Robinson over some Greek words that appear in the New Testament. These Greek words are kind of ambiguous as to whether or not Jesus was considered to be a historical figure. Well, recently, Laura and her co-host Ian put out this video.
Hey Ian, did Jesus exist?
Almost certainly.
Saying Jesus existed is not the same thing as saying you're a Christian.
Right. It just means that there was a historical person in the first century who Paul and other people knew about.
No, it is not almost certain that Jesus existed. Laura and her co-host are going to be going over two pieces of evidence that directly show that Jesus existed here on Earth and not in the celestial realm. So if you want to know why Laura Robinson and her co-hosts are wrong about the existence of Jesus, then please stay tuned. Alright, heathens. Well, if you're interested in this particular topic, being the history of Christianity as well as whether or not Jesus existed, I'd highly suggest you guys check out my CHRESTUS app. I am about to publish a major update for the app that's going to give you a lot more information and a lot more features. So if you're interested in the topic, definitely download the CHRESTUS app today. Previously, in my discussion with Laura, I had asked her about a couple of Greek words that seem to have ambiguous meaning within the context that they appear in the New Testament. Those two words would be adelphos and genomai. They are used in Galatians 1:19 and in Galatians 4:4 respectively. She seems to think that they strictly take one particular definition when both of these words have multiple meanings that are used in different ways by different authors in different contexts. My position is that these two words are too ambiguous to really pin one particular definition on them without taking a greater view of the context in which they are used and who they are used by. The video that she produced answers these questions very specifically.
There are two pieces of data in Paul's letters that suggest that Paul thought he was writing about a historical person. The first is Galatians 4:4, when Paul says that Jesus was born of a woman, born under the law. The word I just translated born is ginomai, and ginomai means become, among other things. It can also mean to make or to be born or to appear. How do scholars know what a word means in context? Basically, whatever the least surprising meaning of a word in context is what the word means.
Well, generally speaking, I think that this is a really good, solid way to figure out how somebody is using a word or what definition somebody is using for a word. But we also have to keep in mind that we're talking about a different culture as well as a different language entirely. It's not just the least surprising meaning of a word in the given context, it's the least surprising meaning or out of place definition for a word for that particular author. And we can figure out what the least surprising meaning of a word is for a particular author by analyzing how that author uses that same word in similar contexts. So when analyzing a word like genomai, it's not only important to analyze the context in which it is used, but also to analyze how Paul uses it in other similar contexts. So some questions that we should ask ourselves while doing this are, what is a natural reading for Paul? Does Paul always use this word to denote human birth? Or does he use other words to denote a human birth? In the instance of Galatians 4:4, on a surface level reading of that passage, it does seem like the natural meaning of the word genomai would be human birth. But the one thing that really casts a lot of doubt on that particular meaning is the fact that it's contained within an allegory. And Paul even explicitly states that it is an allegory. So if Paul means that it's a literal human birth, then he must use that same word when denoting other human births, right? Except the problem is that he doesn't. And as Laura demonstrated, it is an ambiguous word to use for birth. Elsewhere in Paul's writings, whenever he wants to explicitly denote that somebody was born, he uses the word genao. Genao is a very explicit Greek word to denote that somebody was born. Even within this same allegory that we're discussing here, Paul uses the word genao in order to reference other people's births, but strangely enough, not Jesus's. So this begs the question of why did Paul only specifically use genomai to denote Jesus's birth, while using a completely different word that is more explicit about human birth? So let's take a look at how Paul uses genomai in other similar contexts. In 1 Corinthians 15:37, Paul describes our future resurrection bodies as being made or manufactured, using the exact same word that he uses for Jesus' birth. Now, unless I'm wrong about Christian theology, it seems to me like our future resurrection bodies are not born of a woman, but are rather manufactured by God. And then, if we go forward a little bit in 1 Corinthians 15:45, we see Paul describing that Adam was made in the same way, using the same words that Jesus was described as being born or constructed. But again, this begs the question, why would Paul use the same word, genomai, for Jesus' birth, and also for our future resurrection bodies, and for Adam's body, both of which were not born of a woman, but manufactured by God? I mean, does it not matter how Paul uses the same word across all his writings? To me, it seems like this is a very special pleading argument on Laura's end to suggest that Paul was specifically using a literal birth meaning for genomai in this particular passage, and that genomai is only ever used to reference a literal birth when referencing Jesus, but not when referencing our future resurrection bodies and Adam's body.
For example, if I say the bark of a tree, the intuitive meaning is that I mean the hard thing that goes around the outside of a tree. You would need some obvious clue that I actually mean the barking sound a tree makes. So if you say genomai about a cup, you mean made. If you say genomai about a man from a woman, you mean born.
Okay, first off, this analogy just doesn't make any kind of sense. Of course, trees don't make a barking sound like a dog. So your analogy has failed because of the drastic difference between the different uses of the word bark. Being made from sperm and being born of a woman is a slightly nuanced difference. Both are in fact making a human. Given the fact that the Gospels specifically state that Jesus was made by the Holy Spirit impregnating Mary, and not that Joseph impregnated her, is a clear indication that there is a subtle nuance between manufacturing a human and naturally producing a human through normal means. And again, I agree, the methodology that she presents is a good way to determine how a person is using a specific word. But given what we've learned about Paul's use of genomai, it really doesn't seem like he would naturally feel like genomai is used to denote human birth. In fact, it seems the natural word that Paul would use would be genao. So her explanation is actually the less parsimonious one.
Mythicists say that to be made from a woman means to be manufactured with the aid of a woman's body in the heavenlies with the demonically stolen sperm of David.
No, that is not what any reasonable and factually based mythicist would say. Now, I have been researching mythicism for a long time, and I have never seen any mythicist make this specific argument. So my gut feeling here is that you're strawmanning us, because this particular section seems to be a mishmash of several different ideas that to me just exposes how Laura doesn't actually know what the mythicist position is, at least the minimal mythicist position is, which is the strongest mythicist position. First of all, we agree that Paul could be talking about a natural human birth here. But we also acknowledge that Paul does not use that word to acknowledge human birth at all. And in that very same passage, Paul uses a completely different word, genao, to explicitly state that somebody had a natural birth. And then we get into the demonically stolen seed of David, which is actually a mishmash of several different ideas. First of all, we get the idea that Jesus was possibly and probably made from the sperm of David because of 2 Samuel 7:12 through 14. That passage explicitly states that the Messiah archangel would be constructed or made from the seed of David. So that would be God holding on to the sperm of David so that he could, in the future, construct the Messiah archangel's body that he is to inhabit. The demon stealing David's sperm is not to construct Jesus at all. Later Jewish legends have demons stealing the sperm of David while he's sleeping in order to create the enemy rulers that he faces. So, as far as I know, what Laura has described here is nothing that any minimal mythicist would actually say. And it's definitely not the strongest mythicist position. I kind of feel like she's constructing this in order to make the mythicist position all around seem unreasonable.
So basically, they take the barking tree every single time.
Well, Ian here is trying to suggest that mythicists are making a special pleading case for the definition of genomai. But I would counter that with saying that they are actually the ones that are making the special pleading case for the definition of genomai used in that particular verse. They seem to totally ignore how Paul uses genomai to refer to other manufactured bodies. Unless, of course, they think that our future resurrection bodies, as well as Adam's body, was actually born of a woman, which wouldn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
There's a second piece of evidence from Paul that suggests he knows he's talking about a real human being. And that is, there are two places where Paul refers to the brothers of the Lord. In one of these places, in Galatians 1, he names this person as James, the brother of the Lord, and he distinguishes him with that title from Cephas, who is Peter, and the other apostles. So, brothers of the Lord can't mean Christians. It just can't be a word you use to refer to all Christians, because it wouldn't distinguish James from the other apostles. There is absolutely no evidence that this was used as a honorific or a special subclass of Christian leaders. So, brother of the Lord probably means the same thing brother usually means, which is a person who shares a parent with you.
The James, brother of the Lord thing again. I really hate dealing with this argument, but they are pretty hard up on the definition of adelphos. What they aren't telling you here is that the word that Paul uses, adelphos, is actually a very ambiguous word to use if you're wanting to denote a blood kinship. As we did with the previous evidence that they gave, we need to ask what is the natural meaning of the word for Paul, and not just what we would consider as the natural use in this given context. And we can determine what this natural meaning for Paul would be by how he uses this word in other similar contexts. Like, say, when Paul is talking about brothers and sisters of the Lord, or brothers and sisters in general. 1 Corinthians 9:5 actually uses the exact same word that Paul uses in Galatians 1:19, adelphos. But here, Paul is actually referencing a sister or fellow female Christian. It's either that or Paul was describing how in early Christianity they heavily engaged in incest. 2 Corinthians 2:13 describes Titus as Paul's brother, but he wasn't literally Paul's brother, he was just a brother of the Lord or a brother in Christ. And, of course, they use the exact same word, adelphos. And you'll notice when you look at all these passages, a trend is occurring. Adelphos is primarily used to denote a fictive kinship, at least with the author Paul. This is because of Romans 6:3-10 and Romans 8:29. Those two passages establish that Paul considers all baptized Christians to be brothers and sisters of the Lord, or of Jesus. They are considered to be part of God's family and are thus brothers and sisters of Jesus. This fact alone convolutes any familial ties that are referenced by Paul. In this section, Ian also complained about how denoting James as just a general Christian would not actually distinguish him from any apostle that could be referenced here. And I just don't understand why he would think this. The word apostle would be the distinguishing word to denote somebody as not being just a general Christian, but a special type of Christian. While every Christian that had been baptized was considered to be a brother or sister of the Lord, apostles would be a special class of Christian that would need to be separated from the general Christian audience. Because they weren't just baptized a Christian, they had actually personally received a vision of Jesus that denoted them as being an apostle. So it seems to me like Paul is denoting James as just a general Christian here, and there's no real reason to say that this particular phrase would mean that Peter was not also a brother of the Lord. It just means that James was not an apostle.
The mythicist answer to this is that there are apostles, and then there's this separate class of leaders called the Brothers of the Lord, which no one ever talks about, and we have no evidence for except these two passages. To which we say, make up obscure classes of Christian leadership in your novelization of the first century, not your description of the first century itself.
I don't know exactly which particular mythicist position that you're trying to represent is, but it's definitely not the strongest mythicist position, because the strongest mythicist position would not actually assert this as the conclusion. It's possible that there was a special group of Christians that were denoted as the Brothers of the Lord, but as stated in this section, we don't have any evidence to suggest that was a special group. Minimal mythicism would actually come to the conclusion that the most probable and most parsimonious answer would be that Brothers of the Lord just references Christians in general. But you've already dismissed this possible conclusion with no reason. So again, you're not actually attacking the strongest mythicist position, the only peer-reviewed mythicist position. It seems like, at least to me, that you're straw-manning the mythicist position to make it seem more ridiculous than it actually is. I would think that it would behoove you to educate yourself on the strongest mythicist position, which would be the mythicist position that has actually been peer-reviewed, and debunk that.
And then there are the Gospels. The oldest Gospel that survives is the Gospel of Mark. And in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus does not always do and say what the author of the Gospel of Mark tells us that Jesus does and says. So my favorite example is Mark 7, the hand-washing controversy. Mark tells us that Jesus declares all food clean, but if you read the story, Jesus doesn't say or do that. Instead, he engages in a first century intra-Jewish debate over the applicability of food laws in ordinary life. This makes perfect sense as the kind of arguments that we know people were having in the first century in Palestine. It is not, however, what Mark tells you that Mark thinks Jesus is doing.
People who didn't exist in history don't say things you'd wish they didn't say.
What? This doesn't make sense. In Mark 7, Jesus does declare all food to be clean and okay to eat. And it states that what comes out of a person is actually what defiles him. I feel like what you're trying to get at here is like a criterion of embarrassment. And the criterion of embarrassment is just not convincing whatsoever. I mean, just for instance, we all wish that in Spider-Man 3, Spider-Man or Tobey Maguire wouldn't have gone through that emo phase. That is just something nobody asked for whatsoever. But yet it worked for the story that it was contained in. And that is the main point that I want to drive here, is the fact that if you're the author of the story, you can literally make anything happen. And just because you consider it to be embarrassing or something that just wouldn't be written about does not mean that the author would have considered it that way also.
Ian and I are not arguing this because we're apologists.
Go listen to our roast of Lee Strobel.
We're arguing this because we're historians. Scholars don't talk to other scholars about mythicism. It's not covered in the Journal of Biblical Literature, and no one at Yale is writing a dissertation on mythicism. This isn't because Yale is overrun with evangelical apologists, but because this is an open and shut historical case. This is also compatible with a range of religious and theological beliefs, including atheism.
Absolutely. So, Laura, did Jesus exist?
Almost certainly.
But it is being discussed in the scholarship. There are currently 2 peer-reviewed books on the historicity of Jesus. And the scholarly consensus is built by Christian apologists. And they're using the same bad information that they've always used, whether it's to prove that Jesus existed in history or to prove that the resurrection actually happened. Now, given that the majority of scholars in this particular area are Christian, and most of whom are bound by a statement of faith to adhere to Christian principles, it kind of seems like there is a heavy bias in the Christian scholarly community. I know that you're going to probably trot out Bart Ehrman or some of the other skeptics that agree that Jesus existed, but they also make the exact same arguments that the Christian apologists use. I kind of feel like there should be a clear delineation in quality and quantity of evidence in this particular respect, but there just simply isn't. So your appeal to authority or popularity really shouldn't be given serious consideration. Now, I want to give you guys a little bit of a comparative analysis to the mythicist position in general and how it's being handled in the scholarship. When Thompson established the ahistoricity of the biblical patriarchs, he also suffered harsh criticism. He was also described as fringe. He also had scholars that were going after him, trying to destroy his career. Mythicism is only a minority position right now. And if we look back to the establishment of the ahistoricity of the biblical patriarchs, it's only a matter of time before the mythicist position becomes the mainstream position for Jesus Christ. And yeah, there's not a lot of Christian apologists that are actually attacking this particular topic. But I think that maybe, considering that the evidence has been challenged, and not just on a blog on the internet or on a YouTube video, but actual scholarship has challenged the evidence that you guys present, maybe you should take some time to rethink your evidence and actually analyze it. Actually know the position that you're attacking, and don't just attack the worst possible mythicist position out there, or the most ridiculous mythicist position out there. Attack the strongest, peer-reviewed mythicist position that exists. And that would be minimal mythicism, that's presented by both Raphael Lataster and Richard Carrier. So I want to thank everybody for joining me today on this video. If you will, please leave your comments down below with what you thought. Do you think that Laura had really solid arguments here for the historicity of Jesus? Or do you think that her evidence wasn't really all that convincing? Let me know down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you want more mythicist content in your feed. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens!